Alex tastes death and finds a nice restaurant is the 20th episode of the first season of Taxi. This is, of course, directed by the wonderful James Burrows, and as always, there will be spoilers from now as I talk about various aspects of the episode. And before I go any further, I just wanted to say I was really excited to watch this. I took a small break over Christmas from certain sitcoms so I could focus on Christmas films. So I hadn't watched Taxi in, I think, maybe 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, and I was rather excited, and I'm pleased to say I did feel satisfied with watching it. There are some good moments, but that being said, I feel like there's an issue with pacing. And this is something I've noticed with Taxi. Not every episode, but quite often there'll be at least one scene that just seemed to drag on. And it just goes on for way longer than it needed to. And it means that whenever we get to the punchline, it's not as effective as it could have been. And I have an example of this here, because I just felt like it was very slow to get there. But that being said, there were 2 scenes like this in this episode. But that being said, I still rather enjoyed it. And it starts off with everybody in the garage, and Louie casually mentions that Alex has been shot. Of course, everybody panics, and he comes in pretty quickly afterwards with his ear all bandaged up. It just grazed his ear, so it's not too severe, thankfully. And I really enjoyed this scene. It's very, very funny because he's angled to one side, and he can't really hear out of that ear, so people have to repeat things to him. There's one moment where they all move to the other side of him and repeat the exact things they just said, which sounds like it could be boring and repetitive, but it was actually very well executed. There were times when it takes a second, or it took me a second, to understand what he thought he heard. For example, there's one moment where I didn't write it down, so I'm hoping I'm remembering this correctly, but Elaine told him he should go home and relax. And he commented on his trousers. And it took me a second to realise he thought she said slacks, which was very good. I rather enjoyed that. There's a kind of variety in the issues with the hearing there, and I thought it was very effective and very well done. He doesn't want to take time off, though. He likes driving. And then he gets in the cab, he picks up a priest. The priest is acting a little bit peculiarly. And this is the scene that I think took... one of the scenes that took longer than it needed to. He ends up having to rattle off all of the 12 apostles, and it was a little bit slow. Not necessarily the rattling off of the apostles, but the bit leading up to that. So when he got to the comment, "It's not sneezy," it's not that I didn't find it funny at all, but by that point I was kind of wishing things would move forward. So a bit of a pacing issue there, and needless to say, Alex was actually having a lot of issues with driving again. He was terrified, and he decides to quit. And there's this quote, this thing that he says that I rather liked. Everybody's saying goodbye to him, and he says, "A guy leaves the neighbourhood, you see him more than when he lived next door," suggesting that they'll still see a lot of him. But I think that that's actually a really insightful quote because, well, basically, you make more of an effort to see people when they're not near you than when they're there, I guess because you take their presence for granted when they're right next door. And I think that that's definitely something that's worth thinking about. I rather enjoyed that moment, and they all hug him. It's really sweet. And what I did love with the pacing is Louie hugging him. We got a little bit of suspense for a couple of seconds while we wonder if Louie is actually going to hug him, and then he does, and I thought it was very well done. I really enjoyed that, and in general, that scene was very well executed. And then the next scene, the final scene, I think takes up pretty much the bulk of the second half. And it was fun to begin with, but it definitely became very, very slow. He's waiting tables at this really fancy restaurant, really nice atmosphere, really thoroughly enjoyed it. Everybody gets dressed up smartly and they go to see him and he waits their table. And it's nice. It's a nice atmosphere. But it went on for way longer than it needed to, and I just found it to be really stale after a while. And ultimately what happens is Alex decides to go back to being a taxi driver because it's what he loves. And this is just after somebody gives him a $20 tip. And I love that because it's highlighting that sometimes there are more important things in life than money. And in that moment, Alex realised that yes, he was earning a lot more waiting tables than he was driving a taxi, but he was passionate about driving a taxi. It's something he really enjoyed doing. And as such, that was the better option for him. And I really liked that. I thought that was a really lovely message. It just took quite a while to get there, unfortunately. So the pacing in that second half was just very, very slow. I liked some bits here and there, but it wasn't perfect. And as I said, I've noticed this pacing being quite an issue. At least in my opinion, it's an issue. Some people might not mind it. But for me, I've noticed that quite a bit with Taxi, that most episodes will have at least one scene that just goes on for way longer than it needed to. Not enough to affect my enjoyment of the episode. For example, I still liked this one, but it's definitely room for improvement. We could have had further progression with the narrative. We could have had a different environment. We could have had characters interacting differently, more opportunities for comedy, whereas I feel like they go stale quite quickly otherwise. So not a perfect episode, but that being said, I quite liked it. I thought that Alex tastes death and finds a nice restaurant was still enjoyable. And as I said, I was very happy to be watching Taxi again after my brief break, and I'm looking forward to watching the rest. Not too many episodes left of the first season. Keen to see if there are any changes with the second season. I'll find out when we get there. But for now, I'm pleased to say that, although not perfect, Alex tastes death and finds a nice restaurant is still a good episode of Taxi.